I never thought much about how close someone could stand until Reed showed up at the ranch that summer. I mean, I'd worked alongside plenty of people before. Fixing fences, moving cattle, the usual ranch work that fills your days from sunup to sundown. But there was something different about the way Reed positioned himself next to me that first morning we worked together on the north pasture fence line. Close enough that I could smell the soap from his morning shower mixing with honest sweat as the Montana sun climbed higher. I'm Adrian, and I'd been working at the Double Creek Ranch for about 3 years by then. 26 years old, comfortable in my routine, good at my job, never asking myself the kind of questions that keep you up at night. I had my own cabin on the property, a decent truck, and the kind of simple life my father would have called honest work. That was enough. Or at least I told myself it was enough. Right up until the day Reed walked into the equipment barn with his worn duffel bag and that easy smile that seemed to catch on something inside my chest. The ranch owner, Mr. Patterson, introduced us quickly. Reed needed work for the summer, had experience with horses and cattle, good references from a spread down in Wyoming. He was maybe a year or two younger than me, with sun-streaked brown hair that fell just past his collar, and these green eyes that seemed to actually see you when he looked your way. We shook hands, his grip firm and calloused, and I remember thinking his hands felt like they belonged to someone who understood hard work. I didn't think anything else. Or maybe I did, and I just wasn't ready to name it yet. That first week, we fell into an easy rhythm. Mr. Patterson paired us up for most jobs, which made sense since I knew the property and Reed was still learning the layout. We'd head out early, thermoses of coffee rattling in the truck's cup holders, and spend our days checking fence lines, moving irrigation pipes, or working with the horses. Reed was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. He'd make observations about the land, ask questions about the best routes through the property, tell stories about ranches he'd worked before. His voice had this low, steady quality to it, like water moving over smooth stones. But it was the closeness that got to me. When we worked together on fence repairs, he'd stand near enough that our shoulders would brush when we both reached for tools. When he handed me wire cutters or staples, his fingers would linger just a moment against mine. At first I thought I was imagining it, reading something into nothing because maybe I was lonely or bored or I don't know what. But it kept happening. We'd be stretching new wire, and he'd position himself right beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his body in the afternoon sun, close enough that I had to concentrate on keeping my breathing steady. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, we were replacing a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree during spring storms. The work was hard, physical, the kind that makes your muscles burn and your shirt stick to your back. Reed had stripped down to just a white undershirt, and I was trying very hard not to notice the way it clung to his shoulders or how the muscles in his forearms flexed when he pulled the wire taut. We worked in silence for a while, just the sound of our breathing and the tools and the wind moving through the grass. Then Reed said, "You're good at this." Simple words, but something in his tone made me look up. He was watching me with this expression I couldn't quite read, something soft around his eyes. "I mean it," he continued. "You make it look easy, but I can tell you're thinking 3 steps ahead. It's impressive." I felt heat rise in my face that had nothing to do with the sun. "Just practice," I said, trying to brush it off. "You do anything long enough, you get decent at it." "Maybe," Reed said, moving closer to examine the post I'd just set. "But some people have a feel for things. You can tell they care about doing it right." He was standing so close now that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the flecks of gold in his green eyes. My heart was doing something strange in my chest, beating too fast, too hard. I turned back to the fence, needing to put some space between us, needing to focus on something other than the way my whole body seemed suddenly aware of his proximity. "We should finish this section before the light goes," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. Reed stepped back, and I told myself the feeling in my stomach wasn't disappointment. We worked until dusk painted the sky purple and orange, and on the drive back to the ranch buildings, neither of us said much. But I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the tone in his voice when he said I was good at this. I kept thinking about it all through dinner, through my shower, lying in bed that night staring at the ceiling of my cabin. I kept thinking about Reed, and that's when the questions I'd been avoiding started to creep in. Had I ever felt this way about anyone before? This awareness, this constant pull of attention toward another person. I dated a few girls in high school and college. Nothing serious, nothing that made me feel like my skin was too tight for my body. I told myself I was just focused on work, on building a career, on being independent. But lying there in the dark, I had to admit that maybe I'd never let myself feel much of anything because I was afraid of what I might discover. The next morning, Reed was already in the equipment barn when I arrived, checking over the four-wheelers we'd be taking out to move some cattle. He looked up when I walked in, and his whole face brightened with a smile that made my stomach flip. "Morning," he said. "I made extra coffee if you want some." He gestured to a thermos sitting on the workbench. "Thanks," I said, pouring myself a cup. The coffee was perfect, exactly the right strength, like he'd been paying attention to how I made mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt significant somehow, like evidence of something I wasn't ready to examine too closely. We spent that day moving cattle to a different pasture, working side by side on the four-wheelers, and I found myself watching the way Reed sat in the saddle when we switched to horses for the final push. He was a natural rider, moving with the animal instead of against it, and there was something beautiful about it that made my chest ache. When we finally got the last of the herd through the gate, Reed turned to me with this huge grin, his face flushed from exertion and sun, and said, "That was incredible. I love this work." His joy was infectious, and I found myself grinning back, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Yeah," I said. "It's a good day when everything goes smooth like that." We rode back slowly, letting the horses cool down, and Reed started telling me about growing up on his family's small farm in Wyoming, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about his younger sister who was studying veterinary medicine. He talked about his parents with obvious affection, and I found myself sharing things too, about my own childhood in Montana, about my mom who'd passed when I was 19, about how working with animals and land made me feel connected to something bigger than myself. "I get that," Reed said quietly. "There's something honest about this life, you know? Like you can't fake it. The work either gets done or it doesn't, and you're too tired at the end of the day to pretend to be anything other than what you are." I glanced over at him, struck by the thoughtfulness in his voice. "Is that why you do it? Ranch work?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon where the mountains cut into the sky. "Partly. I also like the freedom of it. Moving from place to place, meeting new people, not being tied down to anyone's expectations." He paused, then added, "Though sometimes I wonder what it would be like to stay somewhere long enough to really belong." There was something wistful in his tone that made me want to tell him he could belong here, that I wanted him to stay, but I didn't have the words for it yet. Instead, I said, "The Double Creek's a good place. Mr. Patterson treats his people right." Reed looked over at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "It's not just the ranch that makes a place good," he said softly. Then he urged his horse forward, moving ahead of me on the trail, and I was left trying to figure out what he meant, my heart pounding against my ribs. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying conversations, analyzing every look and gesture, trying to understand what was happening between us. Was Reed just being friendly? Was I projecting my own confused feelings onto innocent interactions? I'd never let myself think about being attracted to men before, had never even considered it as a possibility, but lying there in the dark, I couldn't deny what I was feeling. The way my pulse jumped when Reed smiled at me. The way I found myself looking for excuses to be near him. The way his presence had become the best part of my day. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and went out onto my cabin's small porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, and the air had that perfect cool edge that Montana summer nights get. I was sitting on the steps, just breathing and thinking, when I heard footsteps in the gravel. Reed appeared out of the darkness, wearing sweatpants and a hoodie. His hair mussed like he'd been tossing in bed, too. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, and I shook my head. He sat down next to me on the steps, close enough that our shoulders touched, and we sat there in silence for a while, just looking at the stars. Finally, Reed said, "Can I tell you something?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, and I felt my whole body tense with anticipation. "Yeah," I managed. "I almost didn't take this job," he said. "I had another offer, a ranch down in Colorado that was offering better pay, but when I met you that first day, when we shook hands, I just knew I wanted to stay here. I wanted to get to know you." He turned to look at me, and in the dim light from my cabin window, I could see vulnerability in his expression that mirrored what I was feeling. "I hope that doesn't make things weird. I just thought you should know." My heart was racing so fast I thought he might be able to hear it. "It doesn't make things weird," I said, my voice rough. "I've been thinking about you, too. A lot. Maybe too much." I took a breath, forcing myself to be honest, to be brave. I've never really let myself think about another guy this way before, but with you, I can't seem to think about anything else. Reed's hand found mine in the darkness, his fingers threading through mine, and the simple touch sent electricity up my arm. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said softly. "We can just see where this goes, if you want to." "I want to," I said, and it felt like the truest thing I'd ever said. We sat there for a long time, hands linked, shoulders pressed together, not talking much, but not needing to. Eventually, the cold drove us inside, and Reed hesitated at my door like he wasn't sure if he should leave. I didn't want him to go, didn't want to break this fragile new thing between us. So I asked if he wanted to stay, just to talk, just to be together. He nodded, and we ended up on my couch, sitting close, his head eventually resting on my shoulder as we talked about everything and nothing until the sky started to lighten with dawn. The next few weeks were a study in discovery. We still worked together every day, still stood close when we fixed fences or worked with the horses, but now there was an understanding between us, an acknowledgement of what we were feeling. We were careful around the other ranch hands, not hiding exactly, but not advertising either. This thing between us felt too new, too precious to expose to scrutiny. But when we were alone in my cabin or out on the far reaches of the property, we let ourselves explore what was growing between us. The first time Reed kissed me, we were sitting by the creek that ran through the north pasture, taking a break from clearing brush. He just turned to me, reached up to touch my face, and leaned in. His lips were soft, hesitant, asking a question, and I answered by kissing him back, my hand coming up to tangle in his hair. It was sweet and tentative and absolutely perfect. And when we pulled apart, we were both grinning like idiots. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Reed admitted, his thumb tracing my jawline. "Me too," I said. "I just didn't know how to make the first move." "We're figuring it out," Reed said, and kissed me again, deeper this time, with more confidence, and I felt something in my chest crack open, letting in light I hadn't known I was missing. We fell into a pattern after that. Days filled with work, evenings spent together, learning each other's histories and hopes and fears. Reed told me about coming out to his family when he was 22, about their initial struggle to understand but eventual acceptance. I talked about my own journey of self-discovery, how I'd always felt slightly disconnected from my life until now, until him. We talked about what we wanted from the future, and I was surprised to find that my vision had shifted. Where before I'd only seen myself alone on the ranch, now I could imagine something more, someone to share it with. One evening, about 2 months into whatever we were calling this, Reed and I were cooking dinner in my cabin, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that felt domestic and right. He was telling me a story about his sister's latest misadventure in vet school, making me laugh with his animated impressions when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and just looked at me. "What?" I asked, self-conscious under his gaze. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I thought you should know." The wooden spoon I was holding clattered into the pan. My heart felt too big for my chest, like it might burst through my ribs. "Reed," I started, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything back. I just wanted to be honest about what I'm feeling." But I did have something to say. "I'm falling in love with you too," I told him, and watched his face transform with joy. "I didn't even know I was capable of feeling this much until you showed up. You've changed everything for me." Reed crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and pulled me into his arms, and we stood there, holding each other, while the food on the stove probably burned. Neither of us caring about anything except this moment, this feeling, this perfect certainty that we'd found something rare and worth fighting for. As summer started to fade toward fall, we had to have the conversation we'd both been avoiding. Reed's contract with the ranch was only through the end of August. He'd originally planned to move on, find work somewhere else for the winter, keep drifting the way he'd been doing for years. But now, everything was different. "I don't want to leave," Reed said one night as we lay tangled together in my bed, the window open to let in the cool evening air. "But I don't want to assume anything either. This is your life, your place. I don't want to complicate things." I propped myself up on one elbow to look at him. "You're not complicating anything. You're making everything make sense for the first time." I took a breath, gathering courage. "Stay. I talked to Mr. Patterson, and he said there's year-round work if you want it. Stay here with me. Let's see where this goes." "Are you sure?" Reed asked, his hand coming up to cup my face. "This is a big step." "I've never been more sure of anything," I said, and I meant it. "I spent years sleepwalking through my life, and you woke me up. I'm not ready to go back to sleep." Reed kissed me then, soft and deep and full of promise. "Okay," he whispered against my lips. "Okay, I'll stay." That fall, as the aspens turned gold and the air took on that sharp edge that means winter's coming, Reed moved his few belongings into my cabin. We told Mr. Patterson we were together, and he just nodded like he'd suspected all along, said as long as we did our work, he didn't care who we loved. The other ranch hands took it in stride too, and I realized I'd been carrying fear that wasn't necessary, that most people were too busy with their own lives to judge ours. Reed and I settled into a rhythm that felt like coming home. We worked together during the day, stood close when we repaired fences, and nobody commented on it anymore because it was just how we were. In the evenings, we'd cook dinner together, read on the couch with our legs tangled up, or ride out to watch the sunset over the mountains. We talked about the future in concrete terms now, about maybe saving up to buy our own small place someday, about building something together that would last. One cold November morning, we were out checking fence lines like we'd been doing that first day. Reed stood too close. The ground was hard with frost, our breath making clouds in the air, and I paused to watch Reed work, the way he moved with confidence and purpose, the way the morning light caught in his hair. He looked up and caught me staring, and his face broke into that smile that still made my heart skip. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, walking over to stand close enough that I could feel his warmth. "Just that I'm glad you stood too close that day," I said. "I'm glad you made me notice you. I'm glad you stayed." Reed leaned in and kissed me, gentle and sweet, his cold nose bumping against mine. "Best decision I ever made," he said, "standing close to you." We finished the fence line together, working side by side like we'd been doing it for years instead of months. And when we drove back to the ranch as the sun climbed higher in that impossibly blue Montana sky, I felt something I'd never felt before. Complete. Whole. Like all the pieces of my life had finally arranged themselves into a picture that made sense. I never thought much about how close someone could stand until Reed showed up and taught me that sometimes the smallest distances hold the biggest possibilities. Sometimes standing close enough to feel someone's warmth, to catch their scent, to notice the way they breathe is the first step toward everything you never knew you needed. Sometimes the person who stands too close is exactly the person who should be standing beside you for the rest of your life. And now, when we work the fences together, I make sure to stand close too, close enough that our shoulders brush, close enough that he knows without words that I see him. I choose him. I love him. Every single day I choose to stand close to Reed, and it's the easiest choice I've ever made.